I mean, you mentioned some of the new characters in this government, which much ink has been spilled on. Obviously, everyone knows, Philadelphia's most famous native son, Benjamin Netanyahu. He's back in power now, but it seems like what you're saying is the roster of convicted criminals and lunatics in this cabinet certainly make for some good news stories. But from what you're saying, what I gather is that they are only carrying out just an unbroken extension of what Israeli policy has been for at least as long as I've been alive.
Precisely. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, we can talk about some of these characters in so much as how their career represents the way Israeli society has moved, but it's always been kind of on a linear pathway towards where we are today, right? So, for example, you're talking about Itamar Ben Gvir, probably the most notorious member of this new government. Itamar Ben Gvir is such an extremist that when it came for him to do his mandatory military service, which all Israelis have to do, the Israeli army exempted him, not out of any kind of, not because he opposed military service or anything, but because the guy was considered such an extremist racist against Arabs. The Israeli army was like, we don't want to deal with this guy. We're actually going to give him an exemption. This guy is now in charge of Israel's internal security. He's in charge of Israel's police force. So he went from being exempt, refused by the army, to being in charge of its internal security forces.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, don't have too much sympathy for him, but what are the people in the Israeli security forces feel like taking orders from someone who didn't even serve because he was too racist?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I don't pay too much attention to this kind of stuff, but one thing I know, one thing I've been kind of following over the years is there's been a concern amongst especially more secular leaning or people who would identify as liberal Israelis about the preponderance of religious army captains and officers who are kind of there are certain yeshivas, and especially in the occupied West Bank, producing all these guys that have the same kind of messianic outlook as someone like Ben Gvir. So the fact that he's now in charge, a lot of them, well, they kind of identify with his ideology, if not maybe the fact that he never served.
And I mean, he's a member of a party that roughly translates to the Jewish Power Party. He's been, convicted multiple times for incitement to terrorism and racial hatred. He's a follower of Rabbi Meir Kahan, who is sort of like a Jewish salute power to him. Sort of basically Jewish terrorist groups. He had a picture on his desk, a framed picture of the guy who murdered 29 Palestinians praying at a mosque back in the 90s.
On his living room wall, yeah.
Yeah, on his living room wall. I mean, and this guy, like you said, is now in charge of Israel's internal police force. What are some of the, this is more or less a fulfillment of Israeli government policy, but this does seem to be in some way a new escalation.
Yeah, I mean, it's an escalation. So Palestinians, I think, are worried about the kind of the physical threat that someone like Ben Gvir or other members of this government can pose. As in, he has already lobbied for open fire restrictions to be loosened. Anyone who listens to this podcast or follows the news out of Palestine might be shocked to know that there are any restrictions on open fire regulations for Israeli soldiers anyway. But he wants to loosen that further, right? He wants to to introduce a death penalty for Palestinian prisoners, considering the fact that Palestinians are convicted by Israeli military courts at a rate of 97.7%. That's got people worried. Now, obviously, Israel does carry out the death penalty in a different way, just calls them targeted assassinations. But, this is a guy who, like you mentioned, a follower of Meir Kahane. And I don't know if people know who Meir Kahane was. He was an American-born rabbi who his entire ideology was about ethnically cleansing Palestinians that remained in Palestine, Israel, and doing so kind of, often talked very publicly about his murderous fantasies. So there was I was reading about in the early 90s during the first Intifada, where he told an audience in San Francisco that he wished he could become the in charge of the Israeli army, the defense minister, so he could kick all the journalists out the West Bank and tell the Israeli soldiers they've got 2 days to do what they want to quell the unrest. I mean, this is the kind of guy that this is who Ben Gvir venerates, and this is who the ideology that he comes from. So yeah, there is definitely potential for escalation. There's definitely potential for bloodshed, especially in the West Bank, where unlike say Gaza, there's a much more powerful military resistance that Palestinians have. The West Bank, Palestinians are very much defenseless. So it will be interesting to see how that goes. The other escalation will is in kind of the blurring of the lines between the occupied West Bank and Israel inside the Green Line, and what someone like Ben-Gvir and his position represents, because his position as Minister of Interior Security never existed. There was the Minister of Interior. There were, then the army was in charge of the West Bank, whereas Ben-Gvir is now in charge of the police force that includes the border police that operates in the West Bank. So we're blurring the lines here, and that's a new development, right? His another one of these characters, Bezalel Smotrich, who is from the Religious Zionism Party, another one of these really interesting characters. He's now the finance minister, but during his negotiations with Netanyahu to come on board and join his coalition, he, for the first time, got Netanyahu to allow him to have a direct say in kind of the running of the West Bank, or to appoint the military generals who run the West Bank. So even though he's the finance minister, he's going to have a say over things like the demolition of Palestinian homes in the West Bank, the legalization or the retroactive legalization, development, and infrastructure in settlements across the West Bank.